Why don't we go ahead and start with a word of prayer? Would anybody like to volunteer to pray? Asking the question guaranteed to cause a silence in a Lutheran setting. Go for it, Troy.
Gotta try to remember to hit the unmute button this time. Gracious God, we come to you today and we ask that you would open our hearts and our minds so that we can hear you clearly through these words from the book of Matthew. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So I have some framing and overview to share, some general comments that can guide our conversation this morning. And then we have some examples to dig in and take a look at that sort of illustrate the overarching patterns that I'm going to introduce. And we've got kind of a big example to spend some time on toward the end of our hour. We'll see how much we get to, but we can kind of tailor the examples to look at more or less depending upon the conversation that emerges from those. So Matthew is a gospel that perhaps is more Jewish and more churchy than the other three canonical gospels. We have different windows on the life of Jesus and what Jesus means and how Jesus interacted with his surrounding community in the four different gospel stories, which is not to say that one is more or less true or accurate necessarily than any other, just that anybody telling a story is going to choose the lens through which they tell it. And so for Matthew, we've got a very churchy lens and we've got a more Jewish lens than in some cases. Now this seminary, we're not in a seminary. We could be, we could make our own, but this Bible study series is geared toward looking at the Gentiles that emerge in the Bible and the way Gentiles are viewed in the Bible. So at first glance, looking at a very Jewish gospel could present us with some problems, but Matthew does some pretty interesting things. In some ways, as we're going to see, you could read Matthew as a Jewish gospel for Jews and not for Gentiles. At other points, as we'll also see, you could make the argument that this is apparently either also for Gentiles or just for Gentiles, or perhaps creating a vision in which a broader community, a Gentile community, supersedes the Jewish community. So a variety of different lenses through which we can take a look at this. We tend to use Matthew more than any of the other gospels in church, partly because he is so churchy. And so that is something that becomes attractive. It's the only gospel that uses the term ecclesia, which is the Greek term for church. And it's clearly geared as a gospel toward providing some coherent guidance for a community of believers. So Matthew is addressing a community of faith, possibly one with Jewish roots, possibly one in a Jewish context. We don't know all these things for sure, but that seems to be the direction that he's headed. Because it feels so Jewish in so many ways, it was once thought to be the earliest of the Gospels. We now know that is not true. Mark was the earliest of the Gospels, and Matthew and Luke come along a little bit later, with John kind of bringing up the rear, depending upon who you talk to. That's sort of the general trend. Instead, we increasingly think that the Jewishness of Matthew's language was because of the context in which he was writing, the symbolic language of his own community, the social context that he himself came from. And speaking of Matthew in sort of personalized terms, we don't know that this was written by a guy named Matthew necessarily, but that's what tradition has accorded in terms of authorship. So that gets into a kind of a complicated rabbit hole, but we'll just kind of assume that Matthew wrote this and speak of him in personal terms. It was probably then written in context of a community that was in contact with and also trying to define itself against the developing tradition of Phariseeism. So there's a lot of language about the Pharisees. There's a lot of critique of the Pharisees in Matthew. And the Pharisees were one of many sectors of Jewish thought in the Israel of Jesus' time, but they become very predominant in the period after 70 when the Second Temple is destroyed by the Roman army. So you've got no more temple. All of a sudden, to be a Sadducee is kind of irrelevant and beside the point, because the Sadducees were really caught up in temple worship. To be one of these other splinter communities might be kind of tricky because they are oppressed in very dramatic ways in some cases. The Pharisees, because they're starting to develop this synagogue-based form of worship, so it can be done in small communities, it doesn't have to be attached to the temple. It's a very textually oriented type of faith practice, so the Torah is central. And there is a tradition of reading and commentary that develops that, again, is portable, so it can be done in different places. So that's really what comes to the forefront after the temple is destroyed. And that's the emerging Jewish world that then the Matthean community, these people Matthew is writing for, are in communication and connection with, and sometimes in opposition to. So as a result, we see things coming out of Matthew that are very particular to the Jewish experience, and just the way he frames the story becomes very particular. I know that Pastor Mike has spoken in the past, and you may have heard from others in the past as well, about how things like the infancy narrative of Jesus look a little different depending on whether you're looking at Luke or Matthew. Of course, if you're looking at Mark, there isn't one. If you're looking at John, there isn't one. But even between these two Gospels that talk about Jesus as a baby and a little kid, the stories are different because they're prioritizing different things. And I suspect Ben will probably be talking about that more later during Advent. But the infancy narrative in Matthew really echoes in meaningful ways the Exodus story. So that would have meant something, it would have meant a lot to people who were in this Jewish context. So Jesus is born to save his people, like Moses was born to save his people. And he was saved from a wicked king. He was called out of Egypt after his family needs to flee to become refugees when he is tiny. So all of this is very, very linked into that Exodus set of themes. Jesus is the child God always wanted in Israel. Matthew is very much a teacher sort of a text. There are 17 parables, which is more than in any other of the Gospels. So, and there's a lot of explanation in a lot of the parables of Matthew too. Mark tends to be kind of the in-your-face, like, here is this mysterious story, and it's something that is geared toward kind of creating this change of mindset in the listener, but there isn't necessarily a lot of explanation. Matthew is much more of a teaching-oriented text. And it doesn't necessarily condemn Pharisaic practice so much as the ways that the Pharisees are practicing their faith, or not, as the case may be. So they might not be condemned for preaching, but for not practicing what they preach, or for practicing just for people's approval, to look flashy, to professing their faith in loud and showy ways, the whole like praying on street corners thing, without any sort of corresponding inner faith or inner disposition of submission toward God. Again, a reflection of this Jewish community in which Matthew lives, which he's not necessarily throwing over, although we can talk about that more later. Jesus then is the fulfillment of the Torah, but also the personification of the Torah. So in kind of Jewish practice and emerging Pharisaic practice, God's Spirit is said to dwell among even 2 or 3 people who study the Torah together. So even outside the temple, even in these small settings, Jesus in the 18th chapter of Matthew is said to have proclaimed that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is with them. So he's making a pretty strong equation there that the Spirit of God is him, and he brings with him the Spirit of God. A little bit of early Trinitarian theology there, I suppose, and something that would have really irritated Pharisees too. So you can see some of the conflict emerging, that Jesus is equating himself with the Spirit of God and its presence. Now, in the context of all of this, Matthew makes a lot of different proclamations with regard to the role of Gentiles, of anybody outside this Jewish community. And we can look at several examples of where Gentiles are spoken of in less than flattering terms, to say the least, and then kind of counterbalance them with some other examples. And it starts to develop this kind of complex picture. So I think it might be helpful for us to look at some of these and start to see what sort of patterns emerge. We'll be bouncing around a little bit to several different examples in the text. They don't even always go in chronological order, but sometimes the meaning then evolves as we take a look at these. And there are several in particular, kind of in the Sermon on the Mount section of Matthew, where we've got a really intensive block of Jesus preaching that is recorded. So the first one that's worth taking a look at is Matthew 6, verse 7. I'll give you a chance, if for those of you who have Bibles on hand, and then I've got it here too, to take a look at this. And would somebody like to read just that one verse, chapter 6, verse 7?
Okay. When you pray, don't babble on and on as people of other religions do. They think their prayers are answered only by repeating their words again and again.
Great, thank you. And that's fun. That's a fun translation, because that even gets at something a little bit broader, that people of other faiths or people of other religions, I can't remember exactly what language they use. In the NRSV version, it says, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. So get specific to Gentiles. But that idea of people of other faiths or religions broadly then perhaps translates what he's getting at into even more explicit terms. This is anybody outside the Jewish community. So yeah, don't go around just babbling. Don't go around just speaking empty phrases. The Gentiles do that, thinking that they'll be impressive because of all of their talking. So definitely a diss on the people outside the Jewish community, right? And he's being pretty explicit. How about chapter 6? So same chapter, 32. Let's see here. 30 through 32 gives a little bit more context. Is there anybody who'd like to read 6:30 through 32? Go for it, Diane.
Okay. 30 through 32. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Do not worry, saying, what will we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them.
Awesome, thanks. So another diss, right? In here, pagans is sometimes translated as Gentiles, but again, getting at something broader. And I love that we're hearing, I think now we've probably gotten about 3 different translations. while we tend to use some translations more than others, there can be quite a bit of value sometimes in looking at different translations of the same passage, because the ways that they are interpreted can start to tell us some interesting things. Like looking, for example, at these two passages and seeing what has to be pretty much the same term translated as Gentiles or people of other faiths or pagans tells us something much broader about that term than maybe just Gentiles, which, you know, you could maybe envision as being just one specific group. Conversely, if you're looking at a passage in different translations and the same thing crops up across translations, then we can really have some degree of firmness about the whole thing. But sometimes that helps us gain a little bit broader perspective. But yeah, the Gentiles are striving after all the stuff. They're the acquisition experts. The pagans are not people to be emulated, to be imitated in this context. So a little bit more dissing on these pagans. In the next chapter, chapter 7, verse 6. Would somebody like to read that?
Well, I can do that.
Go for it.
Don't give holy things to depraved men. Don't give pearls to swine. They will trample the pearls and turn and attack you.
Right. So not pleasant, but obviously not thinking very highly, again, of people outside of this community. So we've got some pretty strong language emerging here. Let's see here.
Laura, I like that translation in comparison to the NRSV. They're comparing men to dogs.
Yeah.
Because the NRSV is do not give what is holy to dogs.
Exactly. So again, here, it's getting at something a little bit broader by being able to look at these two. Going from depraved men to dogs, we can see that you can go even so far as to make these people inhuman, but going the opposite direction, it becomes clear that we're talking about people and not just animals. Yeah. Let's see. So then we've got, going back a couple chapters. This is chapter 5, verse 47. We'll take this as the second to last of the examples. And I'll go ahead and read this in the NRSV, but then I'm curious, those of you who have different translations, what, if anything, language-wise differs with this one? Because chapter 5, verse 47, Jesus has been talking about not just loving those who love you, but loving those who perhaps persecute you or wrong you. And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? So does anybody have anything that differs materially on that, 547? Yeah, Kathy?
If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that.
Cool, so we've got some pagans going on, some more broad and general terms.
They're referred to as heathen in mine.
Yeah, so we've got sort of a panoply of different derogatory terms to describe these people, but in all cases, these are the outsiders, right? This is outsider versus insider. We're called to something more. We're part of this community. Yeah, Tom?
I was thinking about, the way the writer of Matthew is presenting this is that Christianity wasn't something new. It was Judaism fulfilled. Mm-hmm. And if you're not getting on this stream of what Judaism is, you're outside of Judaism. You're a Gentile, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's.
Then there's another thing, and it's not said this explicitly elsewhere. Is the verse about not one jot or tittle, not one little dot or line of the law is passing away. That's something people, I think they almost always get it wrong, or it's a big point of contention.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Matthew's saying we still all have to do all this stuff. He's making an argument. We're the real Jews. We have to keep being Jewish, and But
yeah,
I don't know. No. That nobody really thinks that, but I think Matthew's plainly saying that when he says, "Not one jot or tittle passes from the law."
Oh, that's an excellent point, and that actually connects to kind of our last example too. So that I'm glad that you brought that up, and continue holding to that thought. Everybody can continue to holding to that thought as we take a look at some more of these examples, and then take a look at the Great Commission, which is kind of the paramount example of Matthew, and says something that can be interpreted many different ways. So yeah, where exactly is Matt, let's just call him it. Where exactly is Matthew going with this? Yeah, and where does the Torah and observance of the law fall into all of that? Becomes a very open question. Look at my last reference. 10:5-6. Again, continuing to bounce around, but chapter 10, verses 5-6 is a good last point here, and then we can transition toward taking stock of some things that read a little bit differently. Would somebody like to read 10:5-6?
I'll read it.
Cool.
These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, preach this message. The kingdom of heaven is near.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So does anybody have anything other than Gentiles and Samaritans enumerated there? Now I'm curious.
No.
Cool. So those must be fairly specific terms, not terms that are open to much interpretation in the original Greek. But yeah, so you're not even supposed to go talk to the Gentiles or the Samaritans. And the Samaritans, I mean, that's an interesting case because they are not Jewish, but neither are they exactly Gentile. They are people who proclaim the same roots, but have very different practice from what emerges as Judaism, and center their worship in a different place. So just like sometimes the fights amongst the ELCA and the LCMS are trickier than others. The closer you are, sometimes the snippier everybody gets. And so the Samaritans are specifically called out there as people to avoid. Again, one of those close religious kinship connections that can sometimes be even hairier than the more diverse connections. But yeah, Matthew really calling people, his disciples specifically, to minister to the Gentiles, maybe, or not the Gentiles, but minister to the Jews, kind of drawing on what Tom's saying about this being a fulfillment of Judaism, but still staying very much in that community. So we're going to make a shift now at this point, just to complicate matters a little bit, which as a historian is usually my favorite thing to do anyway. It's the ongoing comment of a historian. Well, it's actually more complicated than that anytime there's an event under discussion of any sort. But we're going to move ahead a little bit to chapter 15 verses 19 through 20. So again, bouncing around a bit, but hopefully making the case here, this is something that is kind of a gospel-wide phenomenon that we could talk about. This isn't reflective of a transition from one point to another point over the course of the narrative, but rather they're themes that run alongside each other. So 15, 19 through 20. So this is just following up on the point where Jesus and his disciples are getting called out by the Pharisees for not washing their hands before they eat, which of course in this day and age is even more of a travesty, but germ theory was not a thing then. So this would have been about purity and not about sanitation. Would somebody like to read 15, 19 through 20?
I can do it.
Go for it.
For from the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, all other sexual immorality, theft, lying, and slander. These are what defile you. Eating with unwashed hands could never defile you and make you unacceptable to God.
Great, great. So we can kind of pause here and take a look at this and go, wait a minute. We've just seen a whole bunch of examples of how Jews are held up as the people to whom the disciples should minister, that people from outside the faith, who by extension then wouldn't be practicing the tenets of the law, they're depraved people, they're dogs even. We shouldn't feed our pearls of true knowledge and wisdom to swine. They're showy and they're doing things that are out of accord with what a person of faith should be doing. But all of a sudden we're being told here simultaneously that following the law is not the key. It's what is coming out of the heart that is the key. So there's something a little bit different going on here now. And if you were reading this as a first century person living in a Jewish community, you could probably be excused for starting to wonder how to interpret all of this. But maybe Matthew isn't as narrowly focused as we might initially see from what we've taken a look at elsewhere. And Matthew is where we see some of the stories emerging of some treatment, despite, again, some of this other rhetoric, some instances when Jesus is connecting with people who are outside of the Jewish faith in fairly meaningful ways. One of those being in chapter 8. And this is when the Roman centurion comes to Jesus at Capernaum and is pleading on behalf of his servant, who is in terrible distress. He's had some sort of accident or illness. He's paralyzed. He needs healing. Jesus tells him, okay, fine, I'll come and see him. So that's kind of point number one. Wait a minute, even though we are told a couple minutes later or a couple chapters later that Jesus sends his disciples out to Jewish communities specifically, when a centurion comes to talk to him, he's even willing to go and see what's going on and perhaps heal in person. And the centurion says, you know, I'm not even worthy to have you come under my roof. Just speak the word and he will be healed. He has such a strong level of faith in Jesus' capacity to heal this man that he's recognizing this could even happen at a distance. And he's also making a claim about who's worthy to go through his door. Maybe Jesus as a Jew is not somebody that he expects to be willing to do that because of the purity regulations that are emerging at this time and everything else, that Jesus might not want to defile himself in this way. But Jesus says something pretty interesting then in verses 11 and 12. And I'll read this one And then I'm curious about the other translations, because this is another one where it might say the same thing, but our conversation so far has me getting pretty curious. In 8:11, Jesus says, I tell you, many will come from east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, so 3 big figures in Jewish faith tradition, in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's a bit of subversion. People are coming from all over, and some of those who are at the very center may be cast out. Any of your other translations say anything substantively different there? Again, this is 8, 11, and 12.
Mine says, and I tell you this, that many Gentiles, like this Roman officer, shall come from all over the world and sit down in the kingdom of heaven with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And many an Israelite, those for whom the kingdom was prepared, shall be cast into outer darkness, into the place of weeping and torment.
Interesting. So gets a lot more specific.
Yes.
In terms of naming Gentiles as welcomed in and Jews as perhaps excluded. Any thoughts on what Jesus might be getting at here? And I don't have the like absolute answer, by the way, so this is more of a speculative question than anything else. But we've seen these other examples. They sort of surround this centurion passage, but now Jesus seems to be saying something a little bit different here about who's in, who's out, who this good news is intended for. Any thoughts on what this might all mean?
Well, what's interesting as you read before that, it talks about the centurion, how Jesus hasn't found anybody with such faith in Israel. And so, if Judaism was, the way and the faith, and then Jesus makes the comment that, I haven't found anybody in Israel that has such faith as this guy who is not an Israelite. It says volumes of the fact that that other people are also welcome.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've got maybe sort of a different calculation developing here if it's faith and not the adherence to the law. Maybe we're starting to see a slightly different message counterposed. Or maybe even something that can lead us towards some different interpretations of those other passages. The ones geared toward Gentile showiness or depravity or things like that. Maybe there's a different level at which we can take a look at some of those. They seem to call out Gentile behavior and make an in-group and an out-group, but maybe the emphasis is the behavior more than the Gentile part.
Well, as you're going through this, Laura, I wonder about what the end result of Matthew in this writing. Because, earlier, I think it was chapter 5 or something, or 8, where it talks about the mission of the 12. And that's to not go out to any of the Gentiles, but only go to the Jews. And then that does a complete turnaround at the end of Matthew, where, we're given the Great Commission. And so I'm wondering, what is Matthew trying to do here? What's going on in that time, to make it that so he has to go through so much with the Jewish people to get them to see that that God is for all people, whether it's Jews or Gentiles or anybody else for that matter.
Yeah. maybe we're phasing somewhat. Maybe this is phase 1 and phase 2. I've just been talking with a bunch of bishops about a new program for the way that we put pastors newly ordained or ready to be ordained pastors into congregations, and it's all different phases. So that's the language that's in my mind. But maybe this is, outreach to the Jews is phase 1, and outreach to all the rest of us, given that we're all Gentiles. Probably. I don't know all of your Ancestry.com profiles. So, but presumably, predominantly all Gentiles in phase 2. Yeah. Kathy?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it, because the Jews were always looking for the fulfillment that the Messiah, that it was going to be coming from way back in history, that passed down through generations and generations, that the salvation would come through the Jews. And so that's what they were looking for. And I think maybe it's a broader thing where Jesus was saying, yes, that's true, and it's coming through you first, but it's going to be broader than that. And don't think you get an automatic, ticket to get in just because you're Jewish. This centurion here, he's showing more faith than a lot of lifelong Jews. So yeah, you got the offer first, but that doesn't mean you get an automatic in.
Yeah, there's something deeper going on here, something of the heart and something of faith.
You have to do more than just be Jewish. You have to have the faith and the belief.
Yeah. And then, of course, as we're going to see later on, and in the ways that Paul is dealing with communities who are grappling with all of this, that faith is what's central, and we can't do any of that perfectly. And so that's where we start to recognize that this is something that Jesus gives us first, and we carry on from there. But yeah, there's something heart versus action related that is definitely going on here. 1141, I think maybe because it's already starting to come up, and justly so, because it is so central to this whole conversation. Let's turn toward the Great Commission, because that really is this big sort of piece of both outward focused proclamation, and also again a kind of a grounding for debate over what exactly Jesus means as interpreted by Matthew in this particular section. So this brings us all the way to chapter 28, very tail end of Matthew's gospel. Matthew has the whole crucifixion, resurrection narrative in here. He's flashier than the narrative that we see elsewhere. Sometimes in the other gospels, we just see the women finding an empty tomb. Then Mary noticing a gardener, Mary Magdalene noticing there is a gardener, talking to him, recognizing all of a sudden that he is Jesus resurrected. In Matthew, we get more bells and whistles. We get an earthquake and a scary angel. And so he's presenting a somewhat more flamboyant theme, but all ends more or less the same way, in that the disciples figure out that Jesus has returned, and they're trying to figure out what this means. They're worshiping him. They're doubting a little as well. This is unprecedented, to say the least, and they're trying to grapple with the implications of all of this. And Jesus then comes and talks to the 11, since Judas has betrayed him, comes and talks to the 11 and says that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him, and then gives us chapters 19 and 20. And again, I'll read these and welcome the different translations if there's a different sort of a way that this is enunciated in another translation. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So what's Jesus saying here? And at the same time, does Jesus say anything especially different in any of the other translations?
Well, here he gave permission to the disciples now, besides the Jewish territories.
Yeah, make disciples of all nations. So yeah, definitely expanding now to everybody. And
then it ends all nice and neat, where I'll be with you till the end of the age, and the movie ends at that point, and it's a good ending.
Yeah. Matthew ties things up nicely. It's not like Mark, where everybody just scatters and then they have to write another ending later just to make it a little bit less nerve-wracking. Yeah, so this is something that's going out to all nations. That is another term that I'm told could be translated Gentiles, if you so desired, depending upon the translator. So same terminology. Yeah, Diane?
Yeah, Laura, how many times or how often has the Holy Spirit been referenced? You know, here he says, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Have we heard that much before this, that he talks about the Trinity, that the Trinity is mentioned?
That is an excellent question. And I am not entirely sure of that answer with regard to Matthew specifically, which would really be the most compelling question, since this is Matthew. And so he doesn't talk about this a lot, is the short answer, but he does tell them that there will be, let's see here, that where 2 or 3 are gathered, he is with them. So there's that sort of language that there is going to be some continuing presence, but it's John that really talks more resurrection about an advocate who will come. And that is typically interpreted as the Holy Spirit coming. So this, to some degree, is kind of a new emergence of a thought about what will be there. There is this idea of presence. It was, the Hebrew word was Shekinah, but it doesn't necessarily appear in the Old Testament. It's more like the term that's later given to the idea of the presence of God. So like the cloud over the Israelites during the Exodus that leads them forward or whatever. There was this idea of there being some sort of a hidden presence of God.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's interesting, I just did a little Google search, and it's interesting that the book of Matthew opens, not really opens, but in chapter 3, when Jesus is baptized. And that's like the first mention of the Trinitarian part. And we look at Matthew, and Matthew ends with that Trinitarian statement. And we got the book of Matthew toward the beginning, where Jesus is recognized as part of the Trinity.
Yeah.
Oh, good point.
It sort of comes down in some sense and then is going out at the end.
Yeah.
End of the story. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Now the thing that causes some sort of ongoing conversation that scholars themselves have not necessarily agreed upon. I mean, we know what our Christian theology and specifically Lutheran theology tells us about this question, namely that we're not bound by the law, but we're called to live out lives of service and serving God in response to the gift of God's grace that has been given to us. But more broadly, from a sort of a scholar's reading this and trying to interpret it in different ways standpoint, there's some interesting stuff going on in verse 20. And this ties back to what Tom was mentioning about the law and where the law sits at the end of all of this. My translation, this is...
I have to go, so I'm gonna clock out here.
All right. Thanks for being with us, Diane. But verse 20 starts with the idea that the disciples, when they're going out to all nations, should be teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. What does he mean by that? And again, there's not an absolute answer to this. We've kind of got the theological understanding that has emerged in our tradition, but what does he mean by this? What do we think Matthew might have thought he meant by this? I
keep thinking of that dietary law, because when Jesus teaches on what goes in your mouth can't make you, it's not qualified at all. It's not like you used to need to do this, but you don't need to do this anymore. That was eating the wrong food never made you impure. Mm-hmm. I mean, when he's teaching, that's his teaching. Isn't that his teaching? You know, yeah. It used to be this way. Now it's this way. It's what went in your mouth never made you impure, you know. That's why I'm always curious about when there's battles over kosher food in Acts and who's eating what. Like, mm-hmm. Well, nobody says, well, Jesus said that thing. Anything we put in what goes in our mouth doesn't make us, you know. Nobody ever says that. There's always it's always a battle, you know. Should we be kosher? Should we not be kosher? You know. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And of course, they wouldn't have had the written Gospels, but that doesn't mean they didn't have, in some meaningful sense, at least like collected among the whole Christian community, knowledge of these statements of Jesus, because they had to get from Jesus' mouth onto the page somehow. They would have been swirling around in the interim.
I remember, was it Peter that has the dream, and there's reptiles on the blanket, and
yeah,
and he has to be told in this vision that, well, you didn't need that vision. Jesus already said that. Jesus said you can eat whatever you want. You know, so, I mean.
This is true. This is true. Perhaps it goes toward the human need to be told something over and over and over again. But yeah, some way or another, they're not getting the message. They're needing to be told the message again, or they're needing to be told the message in different ways. Or it's something that only some of them heard and the rest were off paying attention to something else and needing it in a different format. But yeah.
There's a big battle over what is, they use the term abrogated, you know. So you say, well, the eating laws were specifically abrogated. In other words, you don't do that anymore. And then animal sacrifice, that was abrogated, the sacrifice of Christ, and takes all that out, though that was being phased out in Judaism anyway. And if it's not, that's why, like, Sunday worship to a lot of Christians is still really strictly observed, or, you know, it's not super specifically abrogated, you know. Mm-hmm. But that's always a big discussion. And I'm thinking about, like, my Calvinist friends, they always talk about this stuff, what's abrogated and what's not. And,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, what are we still called upon to practice and do? And that, all
the one thing they believe in is, like, civil law, that's the big breaker. That's, you know, they think homosexuals should be stoned to death. Or, you know, that was never abrogated. So that's where that's where you take them. like that's not specifically abrogated. Is that what you believe? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Because if we're only going to go with the regulations that are specifically abrogated, specifically canceled out, then Yeah, I hope none of you are wearing your, mixed fiber knit garments or anything else, because like so much of this is not, not specifically enumerated. And the conversations in Acts have always fascinated me, and I've even taught a little bit on this up at Holden Village. Just when they're making when they're engaged in the discussion about how you deal with a mixed Jewish Gentile community, the things that are not specifically abrogated or specifically canceled are the things that tend to the needs of the community. So, circumcision is not really going to be something that is a community need per se, but maybe some of the very basic aspects of the dietary practices could be. All right. See you later, Kathy. Some of those specific dietary practices where it impacts the community, maybe, some of those need to be respected for the well-being of everybody in that community. So yeah, it gets really complicated. Yeah. And there's debate among scholars about what Matthew means here. If this is just bringing the Israelites into this broader community, if by obeying everything that he's commanded them, he's referring to those differences in interpretation that have emerged, that, as you allude to, that he doesn't say you used to have to do that, or this used to make you clean, now you, are following something different. He's reinterpreting for all time some of these things. It's something that can be interpreted different ways. And it gives us, if nothing else, an interesting window into the fact that Matthew, or whoever was compiling the book of Matthew, was living in a specific time and place. And these were not academic concerns to them, because they were trying to cope with each other and learn from each other and figure out how to live with each other. So in many ways, that's the most interesting part of all this. We know that we have moved beyond debate over whether we are held to every jot and tittle of the Mosaic law, but we know that we're called to live lives of faith in response to God's gift, which is going to mean an ethic that in some respects will follow along with much of that. And more to the point, these people didn't have the benefit of the intervening 2,000 years of interpretation to deal with too. Regardless, though, we've got a story that is bringing the Gentiles in, even in the most Jewish of the Gospels, which is kind of an interesting thing to take a look at. Any closing thoughts or reflections? We're coming up on time, I realize. I'm not sure what Ben's getting into next week, but I guess it will be a surprise. All right. Hearing none.
Well, thank you for today.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate everyone's presence and participation, and we will have Ben back next week. He'll be done with the coursework that in my day job I instructed him to do in collaboration with the Oregon Synod Candidacy Committee, it'll be fun to hear what his experiences have been with that too. We're excited to be supporting his journey toward becoming a pastor himself. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Laura.
Any announcements, Troy, or anything of news of note before we go?
Well, if people are looking for the service online, there was some technical difficulties in the recording, the Zoom recording. It never really happened. So we don't have any sort of video recording of the service. I have a full audio recording, and I'm in the process of trying to put together a service that will be enjoyable online, and hope to have that posted tonight, because it's a little more work trying to put that together than just getting a Zoom video in on the web.
Yeah.
So.
Got
So,
it.
you know, just keep that out there, guys. If you hear anybody talking about it, it's coming.
Yeah, no, that's a bummer. I'm sorry, it's causing
Did
extra.
the YouTube does that self-record, or you just want?
No, the YouTube. My day yesterday is spent all day. Generally, my day on Tuesday is spent most of the day recording everything that goes up for this following service, and I'll be seeing Terry here probably in the next hour to record his portion. Then I start putting everything together beginning on Thursdays and Fridays and Saturdays to get it posted for Sunday.
It's a whole new world. Well, if you needed a couple confirmation pictures, I can send them your way in terms of plugging them.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. Throw them my way, and I'll see what I can do about squeezing them in. You will have to take a look at the welcome, though, because that's of you and Meredith jumping out of the tree. That's pretty classic. I'll be keeping that and using it again.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that was, yeah.
Well, it was great to watch it. I loved it.
Good. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.